She spent 5 years training to disappear, not metaphorically, literally. She studied under one of Italy's most respected theatre directors, learned to move without words, and performed as a mime on stages across Milan. She had a PhD in political science. She spent her 20s handing out Communist Party flyers at protests, marching for women's rights, telling anyone who would listen that capitalism was the disease and fashion was one of its ugliest symptoms. She once said, flatly, that fashion was the worst possible place to be if you were a leftist feminist. Her exact words were that it was horrid. You would think a woman like that, a woman who despised everything the fashion industry stood for, could never become one of the most powerful people in it, right? Well, Miuccia Prada didn't just enter the fashion industry. She took a struggling, half-forgotten leather goods shop with less than $500,000 in annual sales and turned it into a luxury empire worth billions. She invented a look the world now calls ugly chic. She made an industrial parachute fabric more coveted than crocodile skin. And by 2025, the company she once refused to run was pulling in over 5 billion euros a year, buying out one of its own biggest rivals, and being run by a woman Vogue once called the most copied person in fashion. So how does a card-carrying communist with zero interest in clothes end up rebuilding one of the most recognized names in luxury? To understand that, we have to go back to Milan in the years right after the Second World War. Maria Bianchi was born on May 10, 1948, into a comfortable, cultured Milanese family. Her father ran a company that manufactured lawnmowers for golf courses. Her mother, Luisa, was the daughter of a man named Mario Prada, who had founded a small leather goods company back in 1913 with his brother. That company, Fratelli Prada, Prada Brothers, had opened a single elegant shop inside the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II, the ornate glass-domed shopping arcade in the heart of Milan. It sold English steamer trunks, handbags, and beauty cases to Italy's wealthiest families. It was even named official supplier to the Italian royal household. It was, by the standards of its era, a genuinely prestigious name. But here's the thing you need to understand about that name. Mario Prada, the founder, reportedly didn't want women anywhere near the business. He believed the company should be run by men. When he died, leadership passed not to his more capable daughter, but eventually down a line that, by the 1970s, had left the company drifting. Sales were shrinking. The shop in the Galleria was still there, still elegant, but the world had moved on, and nobody in the family seemed to have a plan. Which makes what happened next almost darkly funny, if you think about it. The one family member with the drive, the discipline, and, as it would turn out, the sheer creative vision to save that business was precisely the one person her own grandfather never wanted anywhere near it. A woman. And not just any woman. A woman who, by the time she was old enough to take it over, had spent years building an identity as far from obedient heir to a leather goods company as it was possible to get. And Maria, or Miuccia, as she'd eventually be known, wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of it. She went to the University of Milan and threw herself into political science, graduating in 1971. While she studied, she also trained as an actress at the Piccolo Teatro, one of Italy's most respected theatre companies, under the legendary director Giorgio Strehler. For 5 years, she performed as a mime. Think about that for a second. While her cousins and uncles worried about leather margins and department store accounts, Miuccia Prada was painting her face white and performing silent theatre on Milanese stages. She kept studying too. In 1978, she earned her PhD in political science from the same university. And throughout the 1970s, she was a committed member of the Italian Communist Party, marching in demonstrations, distributing pamphlets, deeply involved in the women's rights movement sweeping through Milan at the time. This is the flaw, if you can call it that. This is the limitation that should have made everything that followed impossible. Miuccia Prada had built an entire identity in direct opposition to wealth, luxury, and consumer capitalism. She had a doctorate, she had a stage career, she had ideological convictions that ran bone deep. Fashion, to her, wasn't just uninteresting, it was almost offensive. Years later, she would admit exactly how conflicted this made her feel. "I used to be ashamed of it because I was educated. I was a feminist," she said. Ashamed. That's the word she used to describe her feelings toward the very industry she would go on to conquer. But families don't always care about your convictions. And in 1978, at 29 years old, with the family company slipping and no obvious heir stepping forward, Miuccia Prada did something she never wanted to do. She walked into the shop in the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele and took over the family business. She wasn't excited about it. By most accounts, she wasn't even willing, she was obligated. This wasn't a dream fulfilled. It was a duty accepted reluctantly because nobody else would do it. And the company she inherited was not exactly a glittering prize. Annual sales sat around $450,000. Only the original store remained of what had once been a modest little empire of Italian craftsmanship. To the outside world, Prada was a relic, respected in a dusty, old money kind of way, but functionally invisible next to the rising Italian houses of the era. Miuccia Prada had inherited a company. She was about to learn just how hard it would be to save one. Think about how strange her early days at the company must have felt. She had spent 5 years learning to communicate through movement alone. No words, no script, just gesture and silence. She had spent years before that debating political theory at university, dissecting power structures and class systems with the kind of intensity you only find in people who genuinely believe ideas can change the world. And now here she was, in a small shop under a glass dome, staring at ledgers and leather samples and struggling department store contracts, trying to figure out how to keep her grandfather's fading name alive. There was no marketing department cheering her on. There was no design team waiting eagerly for her vision. There was, in the beginning, mostly just her doubts, and a company that desperately needed someone to believe in it again. Now, here's where the story gets its first real spark, because you can't tell this story without introducing the second name that would define it. In 1977, a year before she officially took the reins, Miuccia met a man named Patrizio Bertelli at a trade fair in Milan. Bertelli ran his own small leather goods company, and where Miuccia was cerebral, political, and instinctively suspicious of commerce, Bertelli was the opposite in almost every way. Aggressive, commercially ruthless, obsessed with operations and quality control. They were, on paper, an unlikely match. In practice, they would become one of the most effective business partnerships in the history of fashion. He would eventually become her husband in 1987. But long before that, he became something arguably more important to the company's survival, her partner, in rebuilding it from the ground up. Here's the deal they struck, more or less without ever writing it down. Miuccia would control the vision, the design, the aesthetic soul of the company. Bertelli would control everything required to actually execute that vision at scale: manufacturing, retail expansion, supply chains, the unglamorous machinery of turning ideas into a functioning business. It's a division of labor that sounds simple. It would prove to be anything but, and it would take years and a fair amount of failure before the world understood what they were building. Their first real move came in 1979. Miuccia had visited a factory that manufactured military tents and parachutes, and she noticed something: a tough, matte black nylon fabric, the kind her own grandfather had once used to line steamer trunks for protection during travel. It wasn't leather, it wasn't silk, it wasn't anything anyone associated with luxury. It was, quite literally, military-grade industrial fabric. And Miuccia decided to make bags and totes out of it. You would think the fashion world would embrace this immediately, a bold new material from a storied old house. It didn't. The bags were hard to sell. There was no advertising budget to speak of, and the prices, for what looked to most shoppers like glorified duffel bags, seemed absurd. Department store buyers didn't understand it. Wealthy clientele who associated Prada with old-world leather craftsmanship were confused, even a little insulted. For years, these nylon pieces sat quietly on shelves, admired by almost no one, outside a small circle of fashion insiders who could sense something different was happening. But Miuccia and Bertelli didn't abandon the idea. And in 1984, they released the piece that would change everything: a simple, unadorned black nylon backpack that would come to be known as the Prada Vela. No logos shouting for attention, no obvious status signaling, just a sleek, minimal, almost anti-fashion object made from parachute cloth. It was, by every conventional rule of luxury marketing at the time, completely backwards. Luxury was supposed to announce itself with gold hardware, monograms, unmistakable branding. The Vela did none of that. It whispered instead of shouted. This is where I think you have to pause and appreciate what Miuccia Prada actually did here, because it's easy to undersell it in hindsight. She took an industrial material with zero prestige and, through sheer force of design conviction, made restraint itself the ultimate status symbol. It would take almost a full decade, until the early 1990s, for that black nylon backpack to fully achieve its it status, becoming what one fashion historian would later call an anti-status status symbol. But once it landed hard. The bag became a cultural signal that you were in on something the mainstream hadn't caught up to yet. Meanwhile, back home, Bertelli was quietly executing the harder, less glamorous half of the plan. He brought manufacturing in-house at a time when most European luxury houses were content to outsource production and just slap their name on the result. He built out wholesale relationships with department stores around the world. He began opening standalone retail locations in major cities, one by one, city by city, giving Prada control over how its products were actually presented to the world, instead of leaving that up to third parties. None of this made headlines. But without it, the nylon backpack would have remained a curiosity instead of becoming a phenomenon. In 1985, they refined the bag further, adding a gold chain strap and introducing what would become the brand's now iconic inverted triangle logo, a small, understated metal plate, nothing more. It seems like a minor design tweak. It wasn't. That little triangle would go on to become one of the most recognized symbols in global fashion, stamped quietly onto products worth billions of dollars in the decades to come. By 1987, Miuccia and Patrizio were married, and the company that had been sitting at less than $500,000 in sales less than a decade earlier was starting to build real momentum. But Miuccia wasn't not finished pushing boundaries, not even close. And here's something worth pausing on before we move forward, because it says a lot about how Miuccia actually thought about her own strange journey into fashion. She wasn't shy about admitting how uncomfortable the whole thing made her, even as it started working. Fashion was the worst place to be if you were a leftist feminist, she'd later admit. It was horrid. I had a prejudice, yes, I always had a problem with it. Imagine building a growing empire while privately still half convinced that the entire industry beneath your feet was intellectually and morally suspect. That tension never fully left her. If anything, it became fuel. Every collection she designed after that seemed to carry a quiet argument inside it, an attempt to prove that fashion could be smarter, stranger, and more serious than the frivolous stereotype she'd grown up despising. In 1988, she launched Prada's first women's ready-to-wear collection, and this is where her real philosophy as a designer crystallized. Dropped waistlines, narrow, almost severe belts, muted, unglamorous color palettes, silhouettes that deliberately avoided obvious sex appeal or conventional beauty. Critics and buyers didn't know quite what to make of it at first. It didn't look like Armani's polished power suits. It certainly didn't look like the loud, body-hugging glamour coming out of Versace just across town in Milan. It looked, frankly, kind of strange, kind of plain. Some would even say ugly. And that, I want you to sit with this for a second, was exactly the point. Miuccia would go on to build an entire design philosophy around this idea, one she'd eventually put into words herself. Ugly is attractive. Ugly is exciting, she said. Maybe because it is newer. The investigation of ugliness is, to me, more interesting than the bourgeois idea of beauty, because ugly is human. Think about how radical that statement actually is inside a business built entirely on selling desirability. She wasn't rejecting beauty out of ignorance. She was rejecting the bourgeois version of it, the safe, expected, conventionally pretty version, because her entire intellectual formation had trained her to be suspicious of anything that felt too easy, too obvious, too complicit with existing power structures. She took her political instincts, the same instincts that once had her distributing Communist Party flyers on street corners, and she smuggled them directly into the seams of her clothing. It shouldn't have worked. High fashion in the 1980s ran on glamour, on obvious luxury, on clothes that made you look rich and beautiful in ways everyone could immediately recognize. Miuccia Prada built her entire house on the opposite premise. And customers, first a small discerning few, then an entire generation of fashion editors and stylists, began to understand that what she was offering wasn't the absence of taste. It was a more sophisticated, more intellectually demanding version of it. You had to be in on the joke to appreciate it. And being in on the joke became its own kind of status. By the early 1990s, business was accelerating fast. Nylon had moved beyond bags and into full clothing lines. Across town, Giorgio Armani was building an empire on power and polish, and Gianni Versace was building one on glamour and spectacle. Loud, sexy, unapologetically maximalist collections that could not have looked more different from what Miuccia was sending down the runway. Fashion journalists loved framing it as a rivalry. Buttoned-up, cerebral Prada versus flamboyant, hedonistic Versace. Two Milanese houses fighting for the same wealthy clientele with almost opposite philosophies. Miuccia never seemed particularly interested in playing that game directly. She just kept building, kept refining her strange, intellectual version of luxury, and let the results speak for themselves. In 1993, Miuccia and Bertelli launched a second brand entirely, one aimed at a younger, edgier customer, Mayu Mayu, named after Miuccia's own childhood nickname. That same year, they rolled out a menswear collection as well. What had been a single dusty leather shop 15 years earlier was now a multi-line fashion house with genuine global reach, and Miuccia Prada, the reluctant communist heir who once felt ashamed to work in fashion, was being talked about as one of the most important designers alive. But success, as it tends to do, brought new and much bigger problems. Flush with cash and ambition, in the late 1990s, Prada went on an acquisition spree. In 1999, the company partnered with the French luxury conglomerate LVMH to buy a controlling stake in the Rome-based fashion house Fendi, paying roughly $241 million for a 25.5% share. That same year, Prada also acquired the American label Helmut Lang, and shortly after, it picked up German designer Jill Sander's namesake house as well. On paper, this looked like empire building, a hungry, confident Prada scooping up talent and market share across the industry. In practice, it was a disaster in slow motion. Jill Sander herself left her own company almost immediately after the acquisition, citing creative clashes with Bertelli's management style. Helmut Lang struggled under the new ownership structure, and Fendi, while a storied name, arrived loaded down with its own financial troubles, debts that Prada now had to absorb along with the brand. By November of 2001, Prada Group's total debt had climbed to roughly 1.7 billion euros, a staggering figure that was, remarkably, close to the company's entire annual revenue for that year. Everything Miuccia and Bertelli had built over more than 2 decades was suddenly at risk of collapsing under the weight of their own overreach. Picture the position they were in. A company that started the 1990s as a single, growing, critically adored fashion house had spent the back half of the decade acquiring brand after brand, chasing the same conglomerate model that LVMH and its rivals were using to dominate the industry. But conglomeration only works if you can actually integrate what you buy. And Prada, at its core, was still built around Miuccia's singular, idiosyncratic creative instincts. Not exactly the easiest thing to scale across 4 or 5 different design houses with 4 or 5 different creative egos. The debt wasn't just a number on a balance sheet. It represented years of overextension, a group that had grown faster than its own management structure could support, and a very real possibility that the company Miuccia had spent over 2 decades rebuilding could end up dismantled by the very ambition that fueled its rise. If you're the reluctant heir who spent your 20s despising capitalism, and you now find yourself running a fashion empire drowning in debt because of aggressive expansion, you might start to wonder if the critics who doubted you all those years ago had a point after all. This was the darkest stretch of the entire Prada story. Investors were nervous. Analysts questioned whether the group had simply grown too fast, too recklessly. And Miuccia and Bertelli faced a genuinely brutal choice: keep chasing the empire they'd started building, or strip it back down to what actually worked. They chose to strip it down. In 2006, they sold Jill Sander to a private equity firm. Helmut Lang was offloaded as well. Slowly, painfully, methodically, the couple sold off the pieces that weren't working and refocused everything back onto their 2 strongest assets, Prada and Miu. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the story of triumphant, uninterrupted growth that gets told in glossy magazine profiles. It was a years-long process of admitting mistakes and cutting losses, something that takes a particular kind of discipline for people who built their careers on bold, uncompromising vision. And here's the moment where everything came down to a single defining decision. By the late 2000s, with the debt situation stabilizing but still heavy, Prada needed a fundamentally new source of capital if it wanted to keep expanding rather than just survive. The obvious paths, a Milan listing, a private sale, a partnership with another conglomerate, all came with their own complications. Instead, in June of 2011, Miuccia and Bertelli made an unconventional and, at the time, fairly surprising choice. They took Prada public not in Milan, not in New York, not in London, but on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It was a bet on where the future of luxury spending was actually heading, toward Asia, toward a rapidly growing base of Chinese consumers hungry for European prestige goods. Prada became the first Italian company ever to list in Hong Kong. The offering sold over 423 million shares, raising roughly $2.1 billion US. Most of that capital went toward paying down the remaining debt and funding new store openings across the very markets the company was now betting its future on. It worked. The IPO stabilized the company's finances and gave it fresh capital to expand aggressively, but this time, sensibly, back into the two brands that actually reflected Miuccia's vision. Prada had faced its closest brush with financial catastrophe and come out the other side leaner, more focused, and ultimately stronger for it. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the acquisitions, the debt, the slow recovery, Prada quietly became something else too, a genuine piece of pop culture. In 2006, a film called The Devil Wears Prada hit theaters. And even though the story wasn't actually about Miuccia herself, the title alone did something remarkable. It cemented the Prada name as global shorthand for the entire concept of high fashion, glamorous, intimidating, and just a little bit ruthless. Millions of people who couldn't have named a single other Italian fashion house suddenly knew exactly what Prada meant. You couldn't buy that kind of cultural penetration with any advertising budget in the world. It was the strange, almost accidental payoff of decades spent building a name distinctive enough to become a punchline, a compliment, and a household word all at once. Around the same time, Miuccia kept doing what she'd always done best, pushing the brand into places nobody expected. She launched Prada Sport in the late 1990s, blending performance fabrics with high fashion years before the word athleisure was even a word anyone used. And decades later, in 2019, she brought the whole story full circle in a way that feels almost too poetic to be true. Prada launched Nylon, a program to remake its signature nylon products out of regenerated, recycled ocean plastics and industrial waste, with a public commitment to eventually transition its entire nylon supply chain to sustainable materials. The exact fabric that had launched her career back in 1979, an unglamorous industrial material nobody wanted, became, 40 years later, the centerpiece of one of the fashion industry's most ambitious sustainability commitments. The communist who once distrusted the entire logic of consumer capitalism had spent her career trying to make that same industry a little more thoughtful, a little more responsible, one supply chain decision at a time. Of course, no honest telling of this story would leave out the moments where Miuccia Prada's judgment failed her publicly and painfully. In December of 2018, the company faced intense backlash over a line of keychains and figurines called Prada-malia, which featured small, monkey-like creatures with exaggerated black faces and red lips, imagery that many immediately recognized as evoking deeply racist caricatures with roots in American slavery-era iconography. The backlash was swift and severe, and Miuccia's initial public response only made things worse. "I increasingly think anything one does today can cause offense," she said at one point, adding, somewhat defensively, "How can we know all cultures?" It was widely seen as a tone-deaf answer from a designer known for her intellectual sophistication, and it cost the company real trust. Eventually, Prada reached a settlement with the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Miuccia, Bertelli, and the company's CEO agreed to undergo racial equity training. The company committed to appointing a permanent diversity officer, recruiting and retaining more underrepresented employees, and submitting to years of mandatory reporting and oversight. It was a humbling chapter for a designer who had spent her entire career being celebrated as one of fashion's most thoughtful, most politically conscious minds. The woman who once distributed Communist Party literature about equality had built a company that, in this moment, badly failed the very values she claimed to hold. It's worth sitting with that contradiction, rather than smoothing it over, because it's part of what makes Miuccia Prada's story so genuinely complicated. She isn't a simple hero. She's a brilliant, deeply flawed, endlessly interesting person who built something extraordinary while also making real mistakes along the way, the same as most of us, just with the whole world watching. But by nearly every measure of the empire she set out, reluctantly, to save, Miuccia Prada succeeded beyond almost anything imaginable back in 1978. Today, the Prada Group generates well over 5 billion euros in annual revenue, 5.7 billion euros in 2025 alone, up 9% from the year before. The Prada label itself accounts for over 4 billion euros of that figure, while Miu Miu, the younger sister brand Miuccia launched in 1993, has exploded into a genuine powerhouse in its own right, pulling in nearly 1.2 billion euros a year and becoming one of the fastest-growing luxury labels on the planet. And in a move that would have seemed unthinkable to the young woman marching in communist demonstrations decades earlier, Prada completed the acquisition of its old Milanese rival Versace in December of 2025, paying 1.25 billion euros to bring one of fashion's loudest, most maximalist houses under the same roof as fashion's most famously minimalist one. And this is remarkable when you consider where this all started. A woman with a PhD in political science and a 5-year career as a silent mime, who called fashion horrid, who was ashamed to admit what she did for a living, ended up not just running a fashion house, but fundamentally redefining what luxury could look like. She took the industry she once viewed with open contempt and forced it to expand its entire vocabulary, proving that restraint could be more powerful than excess, that intellectual rigor belonged in a discipline everyone assumed was superficial, and that ugly, used deliberately, could be more compelling than conventional beauty ever was. When asked years later how she'd made peace with the career she once resisted, Miuccia didn't pretend the contradiction had simply disappeared. "I'm very proud of my job," she said. "I used to be ashamed of it because I was educated, I was a feminist. But finally, I am proud of it. I earn my own money, which is a huge thing for a woman." It's a quietly powerful statement because it reframes the entire arc of her career, not as someone who abandoned her convictions for commercial success, but as someone who found a way, eventually, to see her own independence and her own labor as forms of the very empowerment she'd always believed in. Her broader philosophy on fashion itself is just as revealing. "What you wear is how you present yourself to the world," she once said. Especially today when human contacts go so fast. Fashion is instant language. For a woman trained in political science and performance, that makes perfect sense. She never really stopped being a communicator. She just changed her medium, from picket signs and pamphlets to nylon backpacks and dropped waist dresses that spoke just as loudly if you knew how to read them. And she's never fully let go of the reins, even as she started planning for a future without her at the center of every decision. In 2020, she brought on the Belgian designer Raf Simons as co-creative director, sharing design authority for the first time in the company's modern history, a sign that even someone as fiercely singular as Miuccia understood the value of eventually building something bigger than any one person's vision. By December of 2022, she and Bertelli stepped back from their roles as co-chief executives of Prada Group, handing day-to-day operational control to a new generation of leadership while remaining deeply involved in the company's creative direction. It was a careful, deliberate transition, nothing like the chaotic, unwilling handoff she herself experienced back in 1978. If nothing else, Miuccia Prada made sure the company's next chapter would be planned, not forced. Today, Miuccia Prada's influence extends well beyond the balance sheet. Fashion critic Alexander Fury once called her the most copied woman in fashion. And it's hard to argue with that assessment when you look at how many designers, decades later, are still chasing the intellectual anti-glamour aesthetic she pioneered back when nylon backpacks first hit department store shelves nobody wanted to buy from. She has been honored with the CFDA International Award and the British Fashion Council's Outstanding Achievement Award. Beyond fashion, she and Bertelli built the Fondazione Prada, a genuine contemporary art institution founded back in 1993 and given a dramatic permanent home in 2015, a striking Milan complex designed by architect Rem Koolhaas, complete with a 4-story building wrapped entirely in 24-carat gold leaf. It's the kind of project only someone who never stopped believing that ideas and culture matter more than commerce could have dreamed up, even while running one of the most commercially successful fashion companies on earth. But I think Miuccia Prada's real legacy isn't the billions in annual revenue, or the gold-leafed art museum, or even the triangle logo recognized in nearly every corner of the globe. It's the proof, sitting right there in her own biography, that the qualities which seem to disqualify you from a path can end up being exactly what makes you extraordinary at it. Her political convictions, her theatrical training, her academic rigor, her instinctive suspicion of easy glamour, none of that made her an unlikely fashion mogul in spite of itself. It made her one because of it. She didn't leave the communist and the mime and the political scientist behind when she walked into that shop in the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele in 1978. She brought all of them with her, and she built an empire out of exactly the parts of herself the fashion world never expected to see. And that, in the end, is how a reluctant heir who once felt ashamed of the very idea of fashion became one of the most transformative figures the industry has ever known.